Thank you, Ms. Hodge. I am super excited for being a part of this presentation. Webinar number 9, pricing fundamentals is extremely important, so I am really ready to just get started.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so welcome again. As Ms. Hodge stated, here's the webinar outline. We're going to talk about what the government wants. We're going to talk about the procurement process overview, considerations for establishing price, preparing to respond to an RFP, what's the contract type, contract price components, the definition of price, determining fair and reasonable, step towards success, and then at the end there'll be any questions which will be submitted to Ms. Hodge. So what the government wants, the government always wants the best price. But as we go throughout this webinar, I'll continue to talk to you about what that really looks like. The best price is not always what you think, but it's always what the government wants. So this chart basically depicts the procurement process overview. The government always has the same process no matter what solicitation they put out. So they always have to identify a requirement, and then they'll do their market research, and then the customer, which will be you in this case, will prepare an acquisition plan, and they will prepare it together with you. And then the procurement planning process begins. What does that look like? So the government will put an RFP out, a request for proposal. And let me go back when I say market research perform. It is very imperative that you understand what the government wants. When they go out for an RFI or a market survey, it's important for you to respond to that because you can impact what the request for proposal looks like. So it's super important and very important for you to get with your customer early on to help them prepare their acquisition plan. So as we go through the procurement process, once the RFP comes out, then you as the contractor will prepare a proposal. As the proposal is processed, the customer, the government in this case, will evaluate the proposal. And then if you get to a certain point, negotiation will begin, then contract award, then you'll perform. Seems pretty simple, but it's extremely hard in this case. So what's important about the solicitation? What's important about the solicitation is it helps you to establish the price. If you do not read the solicitation, you cannot give the government what they call a fair and reasonable price. In the solicitation, it will tell you what's required, what items do I need, what services do I need. While you're reviewing the solicitation, you need to look in the solicitation and say, what critical items is it that the government is really looking for? How will it be paid for? We'll get into that throughout the presentation, but there's indirect costs, there's direct costs, things like that. You have to identify why it's needed. You have to identify when the proposal due, which is very, very important. So if you submit a proposal that's due October the 5th at 12 o'clock and the government wanted October the 5th at 11 o'clock, you're pretty much dead in the water. They will declare you non-responsive. So it's important for you to look at the solicitation and find out when the proposal due, just as it's important to look at everything else. Also, you need to figure out if there's any special requirements. Sometimes when there's special requirements in the solicitation, you may have to have a teaming partner. So it's important to identify things that you can't do, things that you can do, things that are special to the government, and find a team that can actually help you prepare a good winning proposal. Then identifying, is it a commercial item? Why is that important? Well, in the government, if it's a commercial item, you could basically go and buy it off the shelf. So if there is an HP Office Jet printer, you can order an HP Office Jet printer off the shelf and there's already a price attached to it. So it's not much real work to go into getting a commercial item. So identify those early on so that you can already have the price. Once you do that, then you can know if there's developmental or non-developmental things that you have to prepare. Things that are not commercial, things that you may have to build as a contractor, as your university. Is there something that's unique to this solicitation? Is there something in the wind tunnel that you may have to provide that's not really provided before? So that's what we call a developmental or non-developmental item. Then, is this solicitation full and open? What does that mean? That means, is it submitted out to everybody? Is it a solicitation where everybody can propose versus a non-competitive solicitation? So a non-competitive solicitation is when they come directly to you and ask you for a particular price or item. Full and open means that it's full and it's open to everybody. Anybody can propose. And then you need to find out, is this a new project or is this a follow-on? Well, why is that important? It's important because if it's new, then that means that you have a chance to build and be innovative and show the government that you can actually give them something that they've never thought of. If it's a follow-on, the incumbent, and when I say incumbent, that means the person that's already working this award, already had this award. If it's a follow-on, it's a little bit harder to kind of throw them or unseat them unless you have a better price. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, how will the contract be awarded? So there's two concepts that's going around. It's more than two, but there's two concepts that's very, very important to understand. And that's LPTA, we call low price technically accepted, and best value. So the low price technically accepted means that it's the lower price. But if it's not technically sound, first they have to say that you have the technical expertise to do this, and then they'll go to the low price. Versus best value. Best value may rate a different type of score for management. Maybe you manage the project well and maybe they give you 50% of that. And maybe you have a technical expertise and it's 70%, and maybe the price. Price is not always the key, but you have to understand that when you're doing a best value proposal, it has to be clear and concise on as to what you are doing. So best value means that I am getting the best value for the money that you are proposing to me, not necessarily the lowest price. But in the grand scheme of things, if I build a rocket and I put some great and wonderful thing on top of the rocket, am I getting the best value for this because it does something that no other contractor can do? So preparing to respond to an RFP. That is very, very critical. You see the puzzle piece and putting the puzzles all together. It is exactly how it is. Preparing to respond to a proposal is a very, very important piece. You know, the first bullet talks about it can be a costly activity. You have to understand what's required to prepare a proposal. So when you're responding to an RFP, you have to understand the financial implications. Do you have to have a business development person? Do you have to pay that business development person? Is that business development person cost going to be recuperated, out of the award? Sometimes you have to eat that cost. And you have to understand that it's the cost of doing business. Also, when you assemble a team, you may have to hire a program manager. Program managers are usually billed direct to the contract, but what if you don't get the contract? You spent money and you've spent time on getting a program manager that you may have to, at the end of the proposal, fire. Then you have to identify the strong leaders of who can set the deadlines. Like I said earlier, a deadline is extremely important. You have to provide them, him or her, with the resources to meet the deadlines, i.e., a subject matter expert who understands the requirement of the RFP, who understands what it takes. Then you definitely have to have someone that understands contracts. A contracts person can help you unfold the onion, so to say. It can make you peel back all the layers of, what's in this section, what's in that section, how is the federal acquisition regulation related to this? Is the federal acquisition regulation related to this? Then you have to have a good cost analyst. A lot of times people use contracts person as the cost analyst, but a lot of times it's easier to get someone that understands the cost accounting system. It's called CAS. So someone that understands how the government allocates costs is very critical. And then you definitely have to have great writers. The writers are the ones that's going to win the proposals. In a university, we have people that are professors, and you probably write all day, and you probably respond to things with a white paper and things like that. So I don't think writing will be the issue. What I think is writing to the requirement in a university setting will be an issue, because a lot of times you write and you understand what it is that you're telling the government, but are you giving the government what they want? So having good writers that understand what to give the government and what the government wants, that's very important. And I have to keep talking about this, because in the university setting, we do write and we do feel like we understand requirements. But just because you understand the requirement does not mean you understand what the government wants. So be very mindful of that. What's the contract type? So it generally falls into two categories. There's contract types in between, but one side is a cost reimbursable side, which means that it's more risk to the government, and one side is a fixed price side, which means that it's more risk to the university or contractor. So on the cost side, you have stuff like T&M contracts and IDIQ contracts. They're all cost type contracts. And the cost type contract is you basically can propose what you feel is reasonable, allowable, which means allowable per the solicitation, and allocable, which means can it be allocated to a certain pot of money. For instance, can it be allocated to business development? Can you allocate this to um, general and administration? Can you allocate this to salaries? Can you allocate this to advertising? If you can allocate that cost to something that's in your system, then it is allowed. Um, if you cannot find something to allocate it to, for instance, you may have a screw that you're like, okay, where does this go? Generally, it will go towards materials. But if there is not a material CLIN or contract line item in the proposal, there's no need for you to bid a screw, and it's not allocated to something. And the government will essentially throw it out or ask a question. Fixed price is really simple. You all are used to operating in that environment. You just give them a price for your services or for your specification, and that's pretty much it. If you go over that value, you're still not going to get more. If you just underrun a little bit, they're still going to pay you what the proposal states. The next thing, I talked a little bit about it, was contract price components. Cost versus profit. Cost is very critical because you're going to recoup that. Cost is your direct labor, your direct material, and your other direct costs. What's direct labor? Direct labor is a person that's billing directly to the particular effort. So it could be an engineer that's working directly on this effort. It could be a technical writer that's working directly on this effort. And it could be a contracts person is generally billed to general administration. I'll get into that in a little bit. But anyone that's actually doing the work, physical work for the effort, is direct labor. Direct material is anything in support of that effort. So I mentioned the screw earlier. If that screw was in support of building something and you have to have 50 screws, that's direct material and it's in support of that effort. Other direct costs are things just fall out that you don't know. So it's not labor, it's not material, but it's a other direct. So an example of that would be something like a piece of paper that you feel like is a part of a report that needs to be conveyed in the effort, but it's not material, it's not a direct labor, but it's a report, and you printed maybe 1,000 copies of these, and it was in direct support of the report that you're going to submit, that could be another direct cost because it's something that you're not aware of that can fit in any of those other labor categories or categories. Profit. Profit is different from what we say profit is. Profit is anything that's over and above and beyond what we have our costs for. The government states that your profit is your overhead and your G&A. So anything that's billed above and beyond, like your overhead could be your facilities costs, your equipment, your anything that you're providing to the government on a consistent basis, that's other direct costs. G&A is more of your administrative people. So accounting, contracts, legal, excuse me, anybody like that should be billed to the contract because you're going to use them every time. Every time you're doing a proposal, you're going to use an accounting person. You're going to use a contracts person. You're going to use a marketing person. That should be a G&A cost. Definition of price. I said it before. Industry thinks of price differently. We essentially think that the amount of money that a buyer pays a seller for the delivery of a product or the performance of a service is your price. The government says that a price is your cost plus any fee or profit that's applicable to the contract type. So depending on what the contract type is, what the government states, that's the price. So for instance, if it's a fixed price contract, the government might say that's the price. If it's a cost reimbursable contract, they'll say this is a cost type contract. We say it's price regardless. We just say, anything that we sell to you, that's our price. So the difference is that everything that I talked about earlier, the indirect cost, the direct cost, that's the price that the government deems that you should state to them is your price. Not just one number, but a conglomeration of elements that make up one price. Determining fair and reasonable. This is something that it's talked about over years and years and years of contracting. Price must be fair and reasonable. Well, what is that? What is a fair and reasonable price? Fair to both parties? Too high or too low? The FAR says that fair and reasonable price is to a prudent and competent buyer. Um, the more you get into proposing, the government will tell you what a fair and reasonable price is. Well, how will they do that? They have something that's called an independent government estimate that they already know that this is what it needs to be. So when you see the second bullet says too high or too low, what is too high or too low in their standard? And usually they'll give you a chance to negotiate and they'll send you evaluation notices to say, hey, justify why your price is this in this category so that you can give them a fair and reasonable price. Determining fair and reasonable. Like I said, fair and reasonable price is not defined by the FAR. In the FAR, it does say a prudent buyer, but it does not say, okay, fair and reasonable price is this XYZ, but it reflects the fair market value. It reflects the total allowable cost of the performance by a well-managed, responsible contractor plus reasonable profit. So all these words are defined in the FAR, FAR Part 2. So reasonable is defined, allowable is defined, fair market is defined, prudent buyer, like I talked about, is defined. So you can understand how the government is relaying their thoughts to you through the federal acquisition regulations. Fair and reasonable price is not defined by the FAR, but these are the bullets, like that's realistic in the university's ability to satisfy terms. Is it realistic for you to satisfy the terms of the contract? A lot of universities, and not just universities, people in general, contractors in general, throw a number out there. And it's not realistic. They throw it out there to win the award, and when they get the award, they can't operate under the cost that they submitted. And then the government will come back and declare you a as defective pricing because you cannot show them how you came to this price. So the price has to be something that's very realistic. Use past performance, use things that you've done before so that you can justify the price that you're giving the government. And then, like I said, price that a prudent buyer would pay considering market conditions. Like, okay, so if it's snowing outside, I always say, I'm from down south, and I always say you can never ever find milk and bread in the grocery store when it's snowing. Don't know why, don't know what milk and bread has to do with anything, but when it's certain conditions, you cannot find certain things. And so sometimes the price goes up, the price goes down based on the condition and based on the market area. So you have to understand that when you're proposing on this particular effort, you got to find out the background of where is this effort going to be? What are requirements? And okay, so if there's a blizzard, maybe I got to come up with an alternative price, and maybe I need to price in things that's not normally there. So just keep in consideration that when you're looking at the effort and determining a fair and reasonable price, you have to look at the overall effort, and you have to think a little bit, go into your time machine and think about things that could possibly happen. Again, determining fair and reasonable price requires a great deal of judgment. I just said that. It's kind of like going into a time machine or using your intellectual knowledge to obtain resources. Talk to your contracting officer. FAR 31201-3 says a cost is reasonable if it is in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person. They love to use that word prudent person in the conduct of a competitive business. So basically it's saying, any sane person, any good business savvy person should be able to deem a price fair and reasonable. So please understand that when you're determining your fair and reasonable price, it does not necessarily mean that it's low price. It means that this is a fair and reasonable price that I am giving the government. So steps towards success. First, you have to clearly identify the task. Then you have to find out within your organization, do we have enough data to propose on this? Because if you don't, you might as well just no bid. If you don't, you can team with somebody. But if you can't do that, I recommend just don't go after it. A good way, and my partner, Sharon Hodge, is very good on preparing standardized structures for preparing a proposal. A good boilerplate, a good template, so you won't have to have guessing games and, oh, this management needs to look like this technical look needs to look like that. You need to have a standard template on how to submit your proposal. And then you have to have provisions for uncertainties. A lot of times things come up, there's unknown costs, so you need to identify that early on. Recognize and recognize it quickly of excluded costs. All costs should be disclosed and the rationale of why it's not there. So if you're not putting something into your proposal and the government comes to audit you and you say, hey, this is the price that I normally would put in there, but I didn't put it in there because it's a normal cost of doing business, you need to make sure you disclose that when you're doing the proposal. There's something that's called assumptions and conditions. So when you submit your proposal, you can tell them, hey, I normally include travel, but I'm going to include travel in my G&A and overhead and not going to bill it to the government. Please identify that. And do your own independent review of estimates. So the government is going to do an independent estimate. So please go through the process of sitting down with this proposal, give it to your technical person, give it to your proposal writer, give it to your manager, and come together and say, hey, we think that we're confident enough that this is a well-supported proposal and this price is well-reasoned and it's fair and reasonable. So that went by pretty quickly. It's a lot of stuff. So, if you have any questions, you can go to the Knowledge Sharing Center. The website is there. Like I said, submit questions to Sharon Brooks Hodge. We also have a workbook that we recommend that you read. We have a 90-day action plan that includes all of the next steps in order to implement doing business with the government. Pricing is extremely important. So if you need anything, need any assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And again, send questions to vp@we-are-pmp.com. And I want to thank you for coming to our webinar. Pricing is extremely important. If there's not a webinar that, if there's a webinar that you need to attend, I would think that this would be one. Thank you.